So I'm Pistachio. Yeah, I worked in tech for 30 years, worked in banking and finance around that time. My first job was working in Reuters and then as a software engineer. So I'm a software engineer by background. So I've worked in tech for a long time and I like innovation. I like new tech. I've always wanted to, always looked at how tech can change businesses. So I did, BZW, but I did my first sort of digital project in BZW, if anybody knows what BZW is, in the mid-90s, which was the first intranet site between sales, trading, and research. So at that time, there was no site, and I worked on. And over the years, I've always looked at new technologies and how they're going to impact businesses. Obviously, the web came along in the late 90s and 2000s, so we were building businesses around using the web and around financial services. I did my first fintech in the early 2000s, which failed because we were about 5 years too early on what we were trying to do, which was automating back-end processes for buying funds and unit trusts. So at that time, you had to fill a bit of paper in, you had to put your check in the paper clip, put it in the post, and 10 days later, you got your units, which is like, I thought that's crazy. That's going to be digitized. So winding forward, worked in big data. So when big data came along in 2011, 10, 11, I met one of the founders of a company called Cloudera. So and I asked him, what are you doing? So we do big data. I said, what's that? Hadoop. Obviously, at that time, I didn't know what it was. But so we started working using big data and started working with customers in financial services and other industries, helping them leverage this technology. Winding forward, I've always thought about, as I said, how technology is going to help businesses. And about 2021, I decided, after all the work we've done, to actually build a platform. So one of the things that we've seen over the years working with customers is you have to build this tech from scratch, and it's quite hard to do, and it takes a lot of time. And we thought, this is crazy. Why don't we build a data platform on the cloud and provide that as a service? And that's what we started to do in 21. And then Gen AI came along in 22. And I spent a lot of time looking at what the hell, this technology. I started using it as soon as it came out. Obviously, GPT-3 was actually around a year before then, but it just wasn't out in the mainstream media and mainstream usage. And then what we've been doing in the last 2.5 years is looking at how is the enterprise AI stack going to get redeveloped. That for me is one of the things that I see is if you look in depth, and I'll talk about some of the things in a minute, but if you look about what the technology can do, it's really going to change so many businesses. And it's frankly, since the web came along, it's probably one of the only technologies you can say actually it can fundamentally change a business. But the reality is it's really early. Most financial services firms haven't done some things, but not to scale. Some of the fintechs have done a lot more. Banks, large banks and financial institutions and asset managers and private banks are just at the beginning of the journey to leverage this technology. So I'll go through. Do for its work. Let me just move it across. The battery's gone. Sorry about that. Actually, I know what I can just do. There you go. So I've already said that. I mean, I like quoting, if I'm sure everybody knows who Sam Altman is. Battery's gone. And fundamentally, what I see happening, and I'm sure all of you are aware, there's a lot of hype and a lot of news about this kind of technology. But fundamentally, what I see is that businesses are going to be reinvented, and I'll talk about how you judge that, what that's going to look like. But business is going to be reinvented. Some of you may have seen talk about the $10 billion company, which I think is going to happen. If you look at some of the startups that literally started 18 months ago, like one of them is called Cursor, if you've heard of Cursor, which is a software development tool where you can use AI to build software. And their valuation in 18 months is $9 billion, and they're turning over about 200 million. Right. So, this is the acceleration of this stuff is unbelievable. And there's lots of examples. A company called Windsurf, similar product, and they just got bought by OpenAI for $3 billion, and that's in 18 months. It's phenomenal the speed with which innovation is happening. And as I'm sure you know, with any kind of early stage, and I've been an entrepreneur for 25 years, you see the innovation come along and you see startups come along and you see what the hell is going on. And it's phenomenal, the innovation that's happening out there, the number of companies that are coming through. But the reality is, you know, as with any kind of new technology, you have generations of this stuff, you know, cycles and generations. I think, you know, the way I see it is that the next generation of AI companies is about to emerge. So we've had chatbots, and I'm sure everybody here has used chatbots. Everybody use ChatGPT? Right. Oh, somebody hasn't used ChatGPT or something similar.
I don't have a machine that I trust to put it on.
Oh, well, you could do it on the web, on your phone.
Still a machine.
There you go.
Still my phone.
But you know, that's sort of the first generation. The sort of generation which has come actually really quickly in the last year is sort of the automation stuff, where you find a workflow and you do a bit of stuff and you get an output. So it's gone from chatbot to automation, and we're now in the next slide, which is actually enterprise grade applications. Everybody's talking about agents. How many of you keep track of the media of agents? My view of agents is, honestly, it's just an app. It's an app. Whatever we're calling an agent, yes, an agent, and I'll talk a little bit about agents, functionality is different, but at the end of the day, it's just an application. So it's creating huge amounts of opportunities. There's people saying, you know, that there'll be lots of unemployment. And I think that is a real risk. I wrote a paper recently for one of the government ministers in AI, saying that, look, unless the UK starts to take this seriously and train people, there's going to be a lot of problems, because our economy in the UK, 70% of our economy is services. If you imagine the services industries are going to get completely transformed. And so we have to take that seriously and go, what do we do? How do we train people in the UK to work in this new environment? So it's going to have a huge impact. There's lots of opportunities, but also there's lots of change and risk that exists. And I'm sure, you know, like a lot of the consulting companies have stopped hiring or firing people. McKinsey just announced they're firing people. A lot of the banks are not hiring. So, you know, we're already seeing the manifestation of that. So there's lots of opportunity, but also for all of us, he's got to think about what does that actually mean to us as individuals and what we do for a living. And that, again, that is going to change. So some of the stats, I'm not going to read out the stats, but let's just say, hey, there's a fundamental change that's going to happen. Size of the market. I always like to talk about size of the market. It's rather than the numbers, it's not about the numbers really for me. It's really more about the fact that this stuff is going to change everything. That's the point. And quickly. So if you look at the web and you look at data, big data, talked about data earlier, the number of firms, as an example around data, still haven't got data platforms and proper data strategies is immense. It's amazing. I go around talking to lots of companies about data. And so many firms don't have their data sorted or have it in a place that they can use it. And this is 14, 15 years later since this big data trend came along. This stuff is moving so much faster. I just can't believe how quickly things are moving, because it's so easy. As I said earlier, you know, almost everybody in this room has used ChatGPT, and it's amazing what you could do with it. Just literally yourself, without any kind of training, without any kind of experience, nothing. You just go online and use it. And that's driven a hell of a lot of adoption and change, and it's moving way quicker than any of the other kind of technologies that we've seen over the last 20 years. So the thing is that it's going to grow really quickly. It's going to change really fast. And part of the message I talk about is, hey, guys, don't ignore it. You've got to do something. If you want to, depending on your age, you know, some of the people I know in the audience have retired, so he doesn't really care anymore. But I know he does, because he's got lots of NVIDIA stock and other things, so he's happy. But in general, you know, if you're of working age or whatever age you are, it will impact your job and what you do. And so you have to really think about that. And if we look at financial services firms, you know, if you look at how financial service firms have existed over the last hundreds of years, not just 20 years, very little has changed. So if you look at private banks as an example, private banking has not changed in 300 years. So I actually wrote a chapter in a book a few years ago, wealth tech book. You can find it. And it's all about how AI is going to impact that. And if you look in reality, what's happened, very little has changed in banking. In private banking, very little has changed. So what I'm doing is, I'm working on building with some family offices to build an AI first private banking wealth management firm and disrupt the industry. So this is where one of the opportunities is. There's disruption going to happen in many, many industries. And so what I'm interested in is building businesses in these industries, like in financial services, to disrupt the existing and the existing business and the status quo. So there's a lot of new startups emerging, as with fintech 10 years, 12 years ago. There's now another wave of startups going to emerge where they really can disrupt a lot of the different services that firms provide. So those of you who don't know where Gen AI fits in, I wanted to just put a slide up and talk about. I like this little diagram because it shows where Gen AI is, and everybody talks about AGI, right? I put it up there because everybody, there's a AGI, AI is going to have sentience or whatever. I don't believe that. It's not going to be for a while. And I did neural networks, as they used to be called, which is what deep learning is, where you have a network and you train that network and you get output. Machine learning is really more about, as it says there, it learns from experience. You feed it data. So the biggest ones is something called ImageNet. You've heard of that, where you train. What it did was you had a neural network that basically fed in loads of cats. You've heard about this, and then you say, show them a cat, and it'll recognize a cat, and that's sort of machine learning. That's what's happened. Gen AI is actually a new classification of AI. Yes, it's been around for a while, but actually, it's a different category of AI, and that's the thing. People mix AI. When people say AI, it's not one thing. It's all these things and more. So I always get a bit frustrated about AI when people say it's AI. What does it mean? The reality is AI is lots of different things. And Gen AI is one type of AI. And you've experienced it, almost all of you have experienced it, where you type text in and it just gives prediction of text and gives an output. And if any of you are techies in the room, what you can then do with it is unbelievable. I mean, there's amazing things you can do with it. So hopefully this gives you a picture of where we are and where we're going to be, right? At some point. And Gen AI is early, right? That's the thing. However much the hype says it's out there, the reality of adoption in any company is just early. There's some of the early digital native companies have adopted it relatively quickly, but most firms of any size just haven't adopted it yet in anger and transform their businesses. And that's where the opportunity is. And financial services is absolutely one of those industries. So I wanted to put up a slide to try, sorry, it's a bit busy, this slide, but I just wanted to put it up to try and separate, delineate the different elements of AI. Everybody's talking about agents at the moment. But what I wanted to try and do is show you, as you can see here, I'm going to will work hopefully. Yeah, there we go. So I won't go through the slides, but I've highlighted a couple of things where what an agent does, and this is where the difference is between a traditional app and an agentic app, is that it makes decisions, it does inference, and it works things out itself, rather than you having to explicitly program it. So underneath that is an LLM, or more than one large language model that runs it. But at the end of the day, agents as a concept is a completely different way of technology being used for a task. Now that I'm sure all of you will say, well, does that mean I don't have any? Does that mean I lose control? Well, to a certain extent, you do. But actually, on the other side, it actually works things out for you. So you don't have to explicitly tell it everything before it'll do something for you. You still need a context, right? One of the things here is if you don't have a context, so if you're in a bank and you're selling a credit risk product or doing credit risk or selling a credit product, if it doesn't know about it, it's not going to give you a good answer. But if it does know about that and other things around it, it's a lot better in actually making the decision. Still need loads of data. So I don't know why this is working when I point up the screen, but going back to what I said about data, this still depends on data. This kind of AI, Gen AI, still depends on data. And if you remember what I said a few minutes ago about most firms still haven't sorted out their data, right? So until you figure out your data, then feeding it downstream into using Gen AI and building these new kind of applications and agents ain't going to happen. So one of the biggest challenges most financial services firms have, most firms, is that unless they fix their data, unless they organize it in a particular way, they're not going to be able to do AI to scale. Now, the interesting thing is I did a webinar a few weeks ago, and I said, oh, you can use LLMs for data quality. So I've run data management programs in banks in my career. And data quality and data management has always been a problem. It hasn't been fixed. You know, if you go to most financial services firms and banks, data still is a problem. Still, data quality is still a problem. Data governance is still a problem. And we're 25 years in, and vendors haven't fixed that problem still. So interestingly, LLMs can do that. You know, if you want to have a data quality and you're referring to a financial instrument and you have reconciliation issues, large language models can fix that now. But you couldn't do that before. Yes, there's lots of vendors out there that are doing things like fuzzy logic or rules-based or whatever, but fundamentally it hasn't been solved, even with all these tools and technologies. And large language models are really going to help fix that and accelerate that. So, but without data in context, so I mentioned credit risk and credit products, and if you take all the different types of products a bank sells, across all of those things, you want to bring that data together. One of the things that I've seen a few people do is create large language models specifically for financial services. There's a startup from Edinburgh University that's created a Fin LLM, a financial services large language model, specifically to work in financial services. I don't know specific, I can't remember what they were focusing on, but they built one. So the important thing is that this kind of innovation is coming. There's a lot of pieces to it to make this happen. But you can see, getting data right, being able to use that data is absolutely one big part of it. Things like autonomy are interesting, right? So if you wanted to do STP, straight through processing, and you wanted to settle a trade, today there's a shared load of steps in that to make that happen, and it's pretty inefficient. Sometimes there's breaks. So if you imagine, I'm not saying agentic AI and LLMs are silver bullet, they're not. But actually, a lot of things that are problems in the trade life cycle and settlement life, front to middle back office, can probably be solved a lot better in this way. Now, you're not getting rid of the systems of record. So one of the things here is you still need the trading systems, you still need the settlement systems. They're not going away. Not yet. I think they will get redeveloped over time. But the important thing is that actually you can fix some of these things that haven't been fixed before in any other way. But the reality is, as it says on the bottom right, it's complex to evaluate and deploy. So it looks deceptively simple. Because ChatGPT is, unfortunately, the unfortunate thing of it is that if you talk to a senior executive and you say, implement this AI stuff, and they go, well, I need X million or X tens of millions. So what do you need that for? I've got ChatGPT, I just type it in and it works. And unfortunately, what's happened is boards don't really understand the amount of work that goes into delivering a production grade system like this. And there's fundamental difference. I'm an architect, so fundamentally how you architect this stuff is a very different task than the previous architecture approaches and previous ways of building applications and services. So you have to then go back to the board and say, yeah, we're going to have to do a lot of work to change a business and to use this technology. And that's where some of the challenges have been. Lots of excitement, but then reality is now sinking in, and actually it's going to take a lot of time and effort and cost to actually really do this. And I'm talking to, as you can imagine, I speak to lots of banks, a lot of people in banks. The reality is the skills aren't there. So when I'm hiring people, honestly, we have to train everyone. Nobody knows anything. This stuff is so new. You hire anybody, you have to train them on how this stuff works, because very few people know how to do it. And because we're building specific things, we have to train them in the way that we're working. So as an example, we're working on building a 10x software development lifecycle. So you can actually build systems 10x. It says that on the web all the time. You can do 10x stuff, right? The actual reality of doing that is hard. There's a lot of pieces to that to make work, to be able to do 10x work, 10x dev. So when you hire people, you've got to train them on a whole number of different things. So part of the challenge with every financial services firm actually is the fact that just aren't enough people to know about this stuff across the whole levels of the stack. The way of thinking about these things, the way you architect these things, are all different. They're all different. Yes, there's commonalities, but the reality is to build and deliver and productionize these things, it's a different set of problems that have existed in the past. So what does it look like? I mean, I won't go into the tech stack, but in detail. But as I said a second ago, the tech stack is different. The kind of technology you need to run it. So any of you, if you work in platform engineering, I don't know how many people are technical in the room, but if you're doing DevOps, if you know what DevOps is, LLM ops is a whole different discipline on how to build, deploy, scale, manage, operate, test, evaluate models, and how you query those models using what's called inference. That's a whole discipline. Inference optimization is a whole discipline. If you don't optimize your inference, it can cost a fortune, and you get latency and etc. So that's a whole new set of technologies and approaches that you have to go and learn and implement. So what we're seeing now is that we're seeing the emergence of applications. Seeing ChatGPT and chatbots, and what we're seeing now is all the VCs are interested in applications now. What they're looking at is, we want to invest in companies that are building applications on the tech stack. The reality is, what I see is actually people don't have that tech stack to build the applications on. You need to have the tech stack. And as I said before, it's actually quite complex. And there's probably, I don't know what number, I say between 20 and 30 different pieces to bring together to be able to then leverage Gen AI in production. Right. And there's so many moving parts, and it's interesting because the discipline has changed around, going back to what I said about skills. You need data science skills, you need data skills, you need software engineering skills, you need architecture skills. And frankly, you need to bring these things together ideally into a single individual. So some of these people are calling it an AI engineer. So what we're having to do is, if you've got a data scientist, I was talking to somebody from Cambridge the other week, and I'm hiring her to come and work on deep LLM stuff. And she's a data scientist, but she needs to do software engineering as well, which is different. Similarly, if you've got a software engineer, they need to learn how models work, and they need to learn how to do software engineering, data science, and understand LLM's function, so they can write code and software and do that. So, and if you imagine the tech stack, as I said, the tech stack is different. So the kind of skills you need to build around that is different as well. I love open source. That's why I always put that. And there's amazing amounts of innovation going on in the space. And it's great to see that it's open source. A lot of vendors come along and try to be proprietary stacks. And that's what's happened over the last 10 years, where they said it's open source, but it's not really open source, right? So as one example, something called the Model Context Protocol has just emerged recently, which is basically going to wipe out all the integration firms. Right? If you look at MCP, look at it on the web, you'll find it. And it's basically a way to integrate between a model and an application with AI and a backend system. And it's interesting the speed with which adoption has happened with that. So the guys from Anthropic invented it in August last year. They released it in November. By January, Stripe had said we're going to use MCP everywhere. Microsoft's conference about 2-3 weeks ago said we're going to use MCP as a standard. Google has already said that. A lot of vendors have already started implementing MCP servers already. And that's probably one of the fastest adoption of open source projects I've seen. It's phenomenal, the adoption that we've seen. So open source, hopefully now there's a lot of pieces and standards that are emerging around the space that you can then build that stack with. An open source. And as I said, I love open source. So what does it look like to be what I call an AI first? So I didn't invent the phrase, but what does an AI first firm look like? And if you look at the maturity of firms and where they are, right? I should have forgot to update this slide. There should be 0 up there. There should be a 0 where nobody's using AI or using something like ChatGPT. So where we are, most firms are really at the stage 1 on AI for if they're doing any workflow stuff. What will happen rapidly in financial services, when I say rapidly, I mean 3 to 5 years, right? I don't mean 1 to 2 years. And this is where the opportunity from an entrepreneurial perspective in building new ventures, I mentioned one of the ventures that we're building. Firms are going to have to move to an AI first approach as soon as they can. And what we're seeing is the adoption is starting to happen. and the characteristics of what an AI first firm is. And I would say we are AI first. Everything we do end to end in all our businesses are AI first. So we'll have a services business. When I go and talk to companies, we say we do everything AI first. So if a large, name your large consultancy firm charges you £1 million, we will charge you 250K to do the same job, and we'll do it quicker. I'm not trying to sell what we do, but I'm just saying the scale of technology and adoption is phenomenal. And the reality is these firms are not changing their business model. They're not changing their business models because, frankly, it undermines their fixed costs. So if you said to, if a services firm went to a client and said, well, we're going to charge you a quarter of what we used to, they'd be out of business because their fixed costs are so high. So the interesting thing is that a lot of firms are screwed unless they change their operating models or their extended work. And you're seeing it in some services firms where people are not hiring, or they've changed stuff. McKinsey, I think, they said this, 10% of the workforce, something like that. So there's a few changes, but are they changing fundamentally how they work? No. Are they changing the way they service a client? No. Are they changing their prices? No. So the reality is, and if we're talking in financial services, think about that. If you could service a client with your, let's say, private bank and asset and wealth management, you could service a client way more efficiently. Are these firms going to change their fees? No, they're not going to, because their fixed costs are so high. So what we're seeing is, even though this is the stages people have to go through, we don't see that change in traditional firms yet. Some firms are really smart and they're doing it, but most firms aren't. They're not making the changes. So that's where the opportunity is, to build an AI first firm and look across all the landscape of investment banking, asset management, wealth management, fund administration. There we go. That's one classic example. Right. Fund administration pricing is based upon AUM, but even then they have armies, hundreds of thousands of people pushing paper around, and we're in 2025. What the hell? What the hell's going on? Right. Are these guys going to change their business models? I hope so, but I don't see it. Yeah. So if you're in an entrepreneurial environment or you want a job, find the AI first companies and go and work for them. That's where it's more exciting. So maybe, Tony, you can go back to work and work for an AI first company. That'll be more exciting. So let's look a little bit about some of the places within a financial services firm where you could adopt AI. And these are some of the areas. There's lots. As I said, you can share the slides with you so you can look at it yourselves. But I was just going to pick a couple of things. I mentioned a couple earlier. Things like, I'm trying to think, let me just find some. One of the ones I'm seeing actually quite a lot is this one. KYC onboarding compliance. So this is taken from a report by Citibank, actually. It doesn't say at the bottom, but it's something from Citi. So if you imagine AML, KYC and KYB and onboarding compliance, there's still an army of people, even though there's software there. There's lots of software. There's still an army of people doing the work. Well, this is crazy. Right? So there's an opportunity there to automate almost all of that process, reduce costs and people cost by 70%. So, and the interesting thing is this stuff is there's a business case to do it, because, hey, if I can onboard my customer faster and I can do my AML, KYC and compliance checks faster, hey, I can do business faster. So the thing is that there has to be, as I'm sure all of us know, right? There has to be a business case that has to stack up with an ROI. And so I see compelling use cases around. That's one of many. I'm running out of time, so I won't put any more. But you can look at the slides and look at some of the use cases. I don't know where you guys work, but hopefully one or more of these areas are in areas that you work in your firms. Oh, one thing I would say, yes, that's an interesting one. So what's going to happen is firms are going to run thousands and thousands of agents in their business, and they'll have more than one. They'll have multiple models running. I don't know how many, but it'll be more than 10, less than 100, less than 1,000 models. So what I'm seeing is, you have to build a whole new set of technology infrastructure to run that, because today you can't do that. It just does not exist to be able to run thousands of agents all in simultaneously, all through your NVIDIA infrastructure, because you're going to run it on video. Okay. Are you going to run it in the cloud? I don't believe that. I think a lot of the largest financial services firms are going to build their own NVIDIA clusters if they're not already. because you're not going to move data into the cloud. You're going to run it inside your data centers. And therefore, interestingly, on-premise stuff, I think, is coming back. A lot of stuff is moved to the cloud. I think a lot of the stuff in financial services firms is going to go back on-premise. And the last point there is new products and services with Gen AI. So what I see is these agentic models and other services that financial services firms can create new business opportunities and new revenue opportunities. So it's not just about cutting costs. It's actually about innovating and building new products and services for your customers in a more efficient way, and a way that actually makes you fantastic margins. So embedding AI, it's going to be embedded in everything we do. It's going to happen. I don't, people have said to me, well, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, aren't they? Well, yes and no. I think the firms that don't adopt and retrain their people to do AI and humans together are really going to suffer, absolutely. But the ones that are smart enough to say, you know what, we need to retrain our people to use AI as part of their jobs and actually train them culturally, train them from a technical perspective to do their jobs better. This is where people won't lose their jobs if they do that. And actually, if you have capacity, you can move people around, you can do more business. Simple as that. So as a real example, I'm dealing with a fintech at the moment. Fintech does lending. So what they do, lending in the advertising supply chain, so provide invoice finance. At the moment, they have 20 people, which is too many. But even then, they have to treble the lending they do because they've got a credit line for one of the big banks of 100 million. They're lending 5 million a month. They've got to lend 15 million. So in the traditional sense, they would hire a whole bunch of people to do that because how else you do it? So this new technology is going to enable them to keep the same number of people, but actually scale it 3 times. So operating costs are going to be almost the same or less, but the margins are going to be amazing and it can scale way quickly. So that's a real example of an AI first company. And so we're seeing these firms emerge. And these are all the kind of things that people talk about. Decision making is interesting. You can speed up decision making. One of the things I didn't mention was software engineering. Everybody knows about Copilot, GitHub Copilot to help you do code completion. But what I see is what I call system generation. So given my computer science background, I worked on something called formal methods and formal specification. So going from formal specification definition of system and proving it to building, deploying, managing, scaling, absolutely huge. And that's what one of the areas we're working on, because that's IP that we can provide that can help us and other firms build systems faster to get to that 10x. So that's one of the things that we're working on. Yeah, look, customer service. There's already customer service things out there, as I'm sure you've seen. You may have had experience with them if you use any of these agents. That they're already out there. But I don't think humans are going away anytime soon. So if you don't know about AI, go and learn about AI. Otherwise, you're going to be out of a job eventually. So how do you make it happen? Management buy-in is still a problem. People don't know where to do and where to start. Data's still a problem. I already said that. Changing the workforce and reskilling people is absolutely a fundamental part of making this successful. And there's a hell of a lot of cultural change work. There's a huge amount of cultural change work that people underestimate. Change management is still a massive problem. If you don't do the cultural change and the skills and training, all this is going to fail. And there we go. I won't go through this. Think about how you can automate, build roadmaps. And the interesting thing is, I said POCs there. So many firms that I've seen have built POCs and tried to productionize and figure it out and said, oh shit, we don't know how to do this. I'm seeing that a lot. So in the last 2 and a bit years, that's what I've seen a lot. Well, we're going to try and do a POC and see if it works. Because I think, I won't name the bank, a very, very large American bank who I mentioned earlier, have done 300 plus POCs. Very few, if any of them, gone into production. So, there's a lot, as I said before, there's a lot of things to get right, and it's not there yet. It's coming, but it's not there yet. There we go. Thank you very much. I used, as it says there, I used Complexity, Gemini. So as I said, I'm an AI first guy. That presentation, most of it was done with AI. I have no shame. I use AI to do everything. But potential is limitless. And actually, you should start in anger, now, because if you don't, other firms are going to do it, and that will be a real problem. It'll be hard to catch up. So there we go. Complexity, Gemini. So you notice I didn't use ChatGPT. So I don't use ChatGPT. I use Perplexity. I like that. I don't have any shares in Perplexity. I'm just telling you because I like that tool. So thank you very much.
Last page for our presentation. Now the floor is open for the Q&A, so please feel free if you're logged in online to ask your questions through the Zoom Q&A chat functional. Thank you.
Can I start then? I've got the chat in front of me. And can I? There's one question here from a gentleman called Rocky Chen. And Rocky's asking, how do we go about auditing the AI process? He's probably wearing an internal audit hat or an external audit hat.
Use AI to do it.
I
mean, there's a lot of it. Going back to what I said about complexity.
We'll be using AI to
look,
read their questions and then
there's a lot of complexity around LLMs that people don't really understand. So if you asked, one of the challenges with using this stuff in production, if you talk to the FCA, one of the things you have to do in any regulated firm is you have to prove, do reporting and prove what you did and how you did it and how you made the decision. Explainability with an LLM and the output is still a problem. Yeah, there's been some papers recently around explainability and be able to explain it, but it's in data science speak rather than business speak, the output. So tying the sort of trail output from a LLM perspective to convert that to a specific decision is still early to do. So, but it will happen. So explainability will happen and auditing will happen. But it's
regulators are asking that, aren't they?
Absolutely. But it's still a bit early. It's still a bit early. This is a problem.
Isn't that going to change with SLMs though? Because aren't LLMs going to disappear because they're just so, expensive?
Well, I wouldn't call them SLMs. I'd rather small language models. You mean, right? Yeah. I'd rather call them domain-specific models rather than small language models. And domain-specific models, I don't think the problem is going to go away. You still need to explain a decision, but the fundamental architecture of an LLM is still the same. The output you need to do, the input you give, and the output you get, all of that needs guardrails, and there's a lot of stuff you need around that. So I don't think the problem is going to go away. I don't think it's going to go away at all. You still have to do explainability. You still have to be able to instruct the model and be able to prove that this instruction is giving you the result that you read and be able to trace it. And that's still pretty early. Yes, please.
Speaking as a banker, it was a dismissal offence to use any open source software.
Yeah.
Whatsoever.
Yes.
Even if you used a capture system that was open source, you may not have that on our system.
Yes.
Period.
Yeah. Attitudes have changed with open source though. Yeah. I mean, most banks use open source.
Are there vulnerabilities?
How do they explain it?
I mean, look, if we go back to the basic level, Linux is open source. It's open source. Okay, you might buy it from Red Hat, someone like that, but Linux is open source and every bank uses it. So I think the attitude to open source has changed, but I'm sure there are regs and policies and testing and all the other things that come around that. Yeah. So I think we're past this thing about open source not being used in firms. However, there are a bunch of open source models. So open models, open source are different things. So, Llama has an open model. It's not open source. Whereas Allen AI, which is Paul Allen's nonprofit, has completely everything open source. So they've got the models, the weights, the data, and all the other stuff that goes around an LLM, and they've open sourced everything. You can see everything. So
testing.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned testing.
Yeah.
So how do you test a non-deterministic system?
Good question, right? How do you?
I'm asking the question.
No, but that's what I'm saying, right? Yeah, absolutely. This is a new discipline. These things are new disciplines, right? There's a lot of research. I read a humongous amounts of research. So testing a model, one of the things that's emerging as a discipline is called evaluating models. And it's interesting because there's something called SWE bench, SWE bench. If you look at that, there's a bunch of things where people evaluate models, and it's all the ones that we know, OpenAI and all the different models they have and whatever. But my problem with that eval stuff is, well, testing what? What are they testing? What you're evaluating in the model, what you really need is eval in a domain, in a specific use case to get valid and useful output on an eval of a model and what it can do. Right? And that's pretty early, right? Eval is very early in terms of maturity, in terms of technology, in terms of delivery, in terms of understanding how to do eval. So, again, this is why it's exciting, but on the other side, there's so many barriers to getting this into production.
When you're talking to the executives and you said, so this is where it's at the moment, like, so it's almost finished then. How are you dealing with that? Because the AI, when you show them what the Gen AI can currently do, it looks like it's close, but it's obviously still a long way away from a production system.
I mean,
How are you dealing with that kind of problem?
Chief Risk Officer, Chief Compliance Officer. Well, tell me. So, I mean, as actually someone I know quite well, he's a head of AI risks at one of the French banks, and his job, they've got a lot of AI stuff in general AI, the wider AI term rather than Gen AI, working in the bank, and his job is literally to evaluate AI used. I think he said 600 use cases across the bank. So his job is to work this out, test the risk, and be able to push that through. Yes, can we do it? Right? And this is getting even more complicated than it is now. So there's still barriers, right? Chief Risk Officer is not going to let this through. Chief Compliance Officer ain't going to let it through. Yeah. So there's still barriers to make this happen. And the reality is, this is the problem. They have no bloody idea how to actually do it. How do I actually evaluate this stuff? I have no idea. They don't know. They don't know how to evaluate this. So these are the kind of things that firms need to think about. I know another bank actually has risk control towers and a whole bunch of stuff trying to put the foundations in place to then enable productionizing this stuff. Now that's a good thing because they've thought about this quite seriously and figured out we need all these things first before we think about productionizing this. So that goes back to what I said, this stuff is hard to productionize. Yeah.
Another question. I read an article last week about compound bias risk.
Right.
So that each subsequent LLM model compounds the biases that its initial data ingest contained. So that as you go forward in time, the biases are amplified, not reduced. Because the bias is in there, and so it's biased about what it
these are all challenges, right? I'm not going to say to you these people know how to do this. Absolutely. Now, there's some ways of solving that kind of problem. You build guardrails, you build policies, you do a lot of testing, evals, as I mentioned, to understand whether that bias is creeping into what you get as output. Yeah, but yes.
Because I'm thinking of the bias that you find in, say, DeepSeek, where you ask anything political. That's not a bias. That's conscious bias, not unconscious bias.
Absolutely.
That's programmatic.
Yeah.
In fact.
Yeah.
So do you get to examine this if you're employing a system? You get to examine the source code in that system to see if those things are already in there.
Well, yeah. I mean, you can't. It's interesting because how do you pull that specific example out of DeepSeek?
Yeah.
Right? You have to examine the model. You can't just go into a database and look at the tables and go,
exactly.
oh, so I was biased there, right? Because models are not built like that. You need to be able to examine the model through an eval process to figure out these kind of things.
Test it, don't you? Right? Yeah, test it.
Yeah, but testing is different.
You're never going to get that from the weights.
No, but that's the point, right? The point is testing models, eval, is a completely new discipline. It's completely different. Because you can't, as I said, you can't go to the database and look at the database, look at the schema and go and look at the tables and go, oh, that's what it says there. You can't do it. You have to build clever ways of doing eval. Yeah, cool.
Alpesh, given the pace of development of the AI, how do you see the regulators of financial institutions possibly keeping up to date with this?
Well, they're not.
Yeah.
They're not keeping up.
And what impact do you think that has?
Or you won't get into production, right? Unless the regulator does that. I mean, I met some of the people, some of the regulators, and I met some of the people in the innovation team, the FCA. And they are experimenting with this stuff, to be honest, but they like with most other firms, don't have the skills. They don't. It's not as if there's an army of people who want to work the FCA and help people figure out how LLMs are going to work. There aren't. I think what will happen is the firms will do it. The firms will go and say, here's what we've done, here's the proof, and they'll have to hire someone to understand that and go, yeah, okay, that's okay. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. All the controls and all the monitoring and all of that stuff is going to have to be upgraded in the FCA as well, right? So.
Sorry, Alpesh, could I bring you back to some of the participants who are online who are
of course,
throwing questions at me through the chat? And if I may, I'll just go through them rather than do them one at a time. Otherwise, you may be able to blend an answer together. But we've got a gentleman or a lady maybe, but Saigira Nadi is asking, if you're becoming an AI organization, what do you need to change first? The tech stack, the data culture, or the leadership mindset, or any other? And I mean, I can answer myself and say, start at the top, leadership mindset, this might be the most important, but you may have a different view.
I mean, all of them.
Bev is asking, she was a bit worried about the fact we were talking about open source usage, and she says, are you saying that we can pass customer information to an open source platform? What about GDPR laws? Would you have to get your customers to agree for the data to be shared in that way? And then finally, we've got Kai, who's, let me just show you the scope of BCS's membership. I'm currently working on an agri-tech system in Africa. Wow. How would the AI first framework fully be impacted? Would the risks be easily seen? SLMs are being used in different areas. How do I also integrate these?
So let me take the open source one. What I see happening is, to be honest, most enterprise firms are not going to use any of the models out there. They're not going to use OpenAI. They're not going to use Gemini. You know, they're going to create their own walled garden of models. And I know already, you know, I think Google have already allowed firms to effectively install Gemini inside the data centers. So I know someone who's actually done that, where they've taken Gemini. It's not in public. It's in a firewall.
As an engine, I think.
Yeah, and they're using Gemini inside their own data center without any kind of external interaction at all. So in terms of GDPR and privacy, it's already inside the organization and the tenants of the organization. So there's no leakage of data. If you're using models which are just on the web, like OpenAI or Anthropic or the other ones, yeah, you don't know how they work unless you're paying. Even if you're paying, you have to pay a certain amount to say, hey, don't use my data for other things. So you have to be pretty careful. The last question.
Probably my reading of it may not be very good, but he's saying, how would the AI first framework fully be impacted? Would the risks be easily seen?
Well, you have to, being an AI first firm, one of the capabilities you have to build is that new capability that doesn't exist today, to be able to make sure that there's no risk. I mean, it's,
if they're using SLMs at the moment, and he's really trying to build a large data model.
yeah. So I mentioned eval, I mentioned governance, I mentioned risk. There's a lot of things that you need to do. You all have to all of those things which are new.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Speaking about the SLM or DLM, demand language model. Domain, yes. Because there are different industries, but so I agree with you that not every company will use LLM in the future. But is it possible for small entities or like individuals to train their own model in the future, or it is very hard without a certain amount of money or resources?
Well, you don't have to train an LLM from scratch. You can use a model and do what's called fine tuning, or you can use what's called the RAG process, where you take a model and you add the data to it. So fine tuning updates the model itself. RAG attaches a vector database to the model, and you can do it like that. So you don't have to build an LLM. You don't have to build an LLM for your domain. You can use these techniques and others to be able to leverage the power of the model, but add things to it.
Okay, I own my own model.
Yeah. So what you want, frankly, to build a new LLM, if the costs coming down from hundreds of millions to millions, soon it'll be, hopefully, one of the things I want to do is actually build domain-specific LLMs, but that'll be sometime next year. But by that time, it'll be doable at a reasonable cost. Reasonable cost meaning hundreds of thousands of dollars rather than tens of millions. So, but you know, at the end of the day, I don't think most people are ever going to build their own models. Most firms, medium-sized firms are. Large firms, banks will. They probably will because they've got the resources to do it. But I don't see most medium and small firms ever do that. That's why there's an emerging market. There are actually thousands of models. So if you go to Hugging Face, if you know what Hugging Face is, there are already thousands of LLMs on there. Thousands. So
Okay, so they will be using existing one.
yeah, most people use the existing one and use the techniques I've mentioned to adapt that model for their use case.
Thank you.
Sorry, I got another one that nobody else has. Do you think that the European regulation will inhibit development in the EU, not in the UK? I'm thinking particularly of the liability model that's built into EU. So even if you buy a model and modify the model maker is still liable for its change and usage by so the chain of liability goes right back to the source.
Right. EU AI, you're talking about the EU AI Act.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, do you think it can survive that act? Can survive the
It'll get modified.
development?
It'll get modified like every act does, right? Because all the firms are going to go to them and say, we can't do it.
Yeah.
As with all the regulation that comes out of the EU, it either gets delayed or there's a massive lobby group of all corporates going to the EU and saying, we can't do this. And that's what will happen. And people don't really know, going back to what I said about AI governance, number of firms I've gone to and said, oh, have you thought about AI governance? I go, what for? Well, there's the EU AI Act. And the reality is most firms, if you operate and do anything outside the EU, outside the UK to the EU, then you've got to comply with it. That's it. So actually in any firm. So it's not we're in the UK, don't need to comply with it. You absolutely have to, because if you're a supplier to anybody in the EU, you have to comply. So the reality is that you can't get away from the EU AI Act. But the reality is, what I've seen, as I said, when I talk to people, say, well, have you thought about the EU AI Act and AI risk and AI governance? Most firms are just haven't even started.
Yeah. Right. The question is still is okay, so what does if any roles of insurance company to play in all these? Because we know that in a professional setting, everything has to be insured. And do you see any role to be played by insurance company in all these, and also in professional indemnity insurance as well? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, let's be honest, it's an opportunity for insurance companies to build new insurance products. How do they build the underwriting model? You know, I mean, they're going to have to, right? But, you know, insurers are absolutely, there'll be insurance policies. Absolutely. I've got no doubt. Are they thinking about this? Probably somewhere in the ecosystem of the most innovative insurance companies and reinsurance companies, probably. Have they emerged yet? Not that I've seen. I can't say that I've seen, and I've dealt with some insurers. I've not seen anybody talk about this kind of insurance yet. It's not in public anyway. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. I'm an engineer here, but I'm curious about like what do you image? What do you think everyone's career in the future? Do we all need to learn about coding, or at least have some knowledge about software?
I mean, most users don't need to know about coding. I don't think so. Okay. Engineers like you, as I said earlier, I think engineers are going to have to learn data science. Learn more about data science and how LLMs function. That's a data science thing, not a computer science thing. And how, because that'll impact on how you write software, what you write, how you build prompts, doing prompting, right? How you build inference, etc. So for me, if you're a software engineer, you're going to have to learn data science and actually learn more about data. That's what I said about this AI engineer idea.
So it's the opposite way. Like we engineers need to learn more about like knowledges in other industries.
Yeah, well, in other disciplines like data science. Absolutely, absolutely, without a doubt. I think that's why this AI. It's not I didn't come up with it, but for me, what I perceive as an AI engineer is someone who knows those three things.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do with everybody that we're hiring is actually make people AI engineers. So we have those disciplines and those skills.
Followed by that question, so would you say in the future, the skill set would be more like a
About
broad rather than like specialized in certain area?
I don't know if it's
Like,
broad. I think it's just things that you need to learn. Yeah. So if you're a data scientist, you need to learn software engineering.
Yeah.
Right. Because the data scientist is going to be doing prompt engineering and going to be writing. Well, they already write Python, but more Python, for example, or creating Python code. Right. Not necessarily writing it, creating Python. So they need to understand how to prompt the model to get the right output. Yeah. As a software engineer, you have to learn how does the model work? How are the inner workings of the not the detailed stuff, as with anything, right? But really understanding how do I get the best out of the model for the use case and the application that I'm building.
Yeah.
And that an engineer needs to learn that, and that's data science.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more?
A little bit.
Not on the chat. I've got a couple of follow-ups, but I think with the fairness, I think we should probably.
One more here.
I think it's a quick one. You danced a little bit around job losses.
Yeah.
If actually Gen AI in particular rolls out at scale, what's the compliance and risk? Do you not think there's going to be quite a big impact?
Oh yeah,
because I know a couple of MDs in banks in those areas who are currently rethinking their workforce for the future.
Yeah, I agree. There will be.
That's a lot of people are going to be affected.
Yeah.
There aren't really jobs for them to roll to because you just need less of them.
But I agree.
It seems like a government policy failing to me, not rather than an industry failing.
Yeah, no, I've talked to people in compliance. I've been dealing with actually a fintech, who's head of compliance in the fintech, and they're just listed. And he knows this is going to happen. He wants to do it. He wants to reduce the team because it's a cost for them. So,
Sorry, could I just say something? But don't you think even with AI, you still need a human in the loop?
yes,
You'll need some people.
but you'll need 70% less people.
There's an awful lot of ticking
and on the areas that we're talking about, you need 70%.
But then again, it could be that you might need these people in other areas. Maybe they need to be redeployed elsewhere, not lose them totally.
I just have a bad feeling that's a very optimistic view.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's going to be.
I mean, that's the nice story, which we're all telling you.
Yeah.
I'm just not convinced myself it's true.
I think there will be job losses. I've no doubt. There's going to be. Why would you keep these people on if you reduce your operating costs
Well, exactly.
and improve the services, reduce operating costs?
They're all in cost centers. They're not fee earners.
Yeah.
So
And so, absolutely. That's one, I think, aren't we? Are we over?
Well, I don't know. I've got Sigarinado has come back again. It keeps on.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions.
Data culture. And he says if everything has to change, both data culture and tech leadership, etc., where do we see the biggest point of resistance?
So I see it every day. It's interesting, right? When I talk to firms and talk to people who have armies of people working for them, there's a massive amount of fear. Honestly, there is fear. You can see it in their eyes. You can see the fear of what the hell is going to happen to my job. So it's there. It manifests itself. There is fear out there. Honestly, there is. When people who've actually thought about this a bit and think, oh, God, my job is going to disappear. What the hell do I do? Or there's a lot of fear. There is.
I was just thinking to myself that you mentioned it about AI and how it will change, but underlying it all, the same banking products are being sold, and the consumers are still being delivered the same old banking products that they've been doing for years. They're just getting them in a more efficient way, maybe, and maybe a more informed way, maybe a slightly less risky way.
Well, there's a whole another universe of things. If I mentioned agents before, the concepts around your personal agent doing things for, like, for example, booking holiday. Go out. You have an agent that knows about you and what you do, and it'll go at the back end and it'll go and do it all for you and find a book holiday and whatever for you, payments for you. So banks, payments, right. Etc. It'll understand you and it'll go and find you a mortgage and it'll do all the process for you because it does it because the bank's agent knows you and it'll put it in place, and you want to talk to anybody, it'll just do it for you. So this is what people are talking about happening. The agentic universe is part of what people are talking about. So this is 5 years plus away. Some areas are going to move faster. right? But this kind of stuff is possible. So are banks safe? No, because I think fundamentally there is a whole different way of doing business that's coming.
Yeah, we haven't talked about security.
Yeah, well, it will all be secure next time. Thanks very much, everyone.
Right.